Welcome back to Show and Tell. Today, my guest is from Hungary, and she told me that her name is very hard to pronounce, but if I say Timi, that's sort of close to what it is. But please introduce yourself and tell my viewers where you're from. Let's start with that. Where are you from and your name?
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Timi névesít. Actually, that's the long version, and Timi is the short one. And I'm from Hungary, Budapest. So I've been living here basically all my life, with a couple of years abroad. So
So, because Budapest is someplace that I have been, I can sing its praises. If you haven't been there, it's a marvelous city. Really, when I did a tour, well, not a tour, I mean, we planned our own trip of Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, just Berlin and Germany. Vienna is the only place in Austria. But, those countries, Budapest really stood out for me, that parliament building.
yeah.
I know it's not a travel channel. I know we're really here to talk about knitting, but a friend of mine who's European told me that Hungary wanted to have the most gorgeous parliament building of all of Europe. So they really put an emphasis on making theirs super gorgeous so they could have the best of something. Is that true?
Yeah, it was actually a competition, and they built the first three. That the first place, the second place, third. They are all in the same square actually, and obviously the one that got the first place was built in the one-to-one scale, and the other two are smaller and just behind the parliament. So you can actually have a look at what all the other ideas were as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. But having the river right there, you can be on a boat and see it lit up at night. We went inside, we took the tour of it. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's just something incredible. But as viewers will know, I always ask my guests for something off the beaten path. If you're coming to their city or their town, what will you not find in the guidebook? So I asked Timmy to please share with us something that she knows of her city since she's lived there all of her life.
Yeah. So actually what came to mind is a pretty rare occasion even for us. So in Budapest, as you have mentioned, we have the Danube cutting through the city. And we have about 7 to 10 bridges, seven in the downtown area. And one of the bridges actually leads to an island. It's called Margaret Island. And one of the bridge piers near the island, during drought times, the island itself extends towards the pier, and they sometimes have like concerts there, or they have parties, and especially during summer, it's pretty cool to go there, and you are just like as if you would be standing right in the middle of the water under the bridge. So I think that is a lovely experience, and it's very rare that you can actually do that.
Wow, it sounds amazing, really amazing. Okay, so let's get into sharing your knitting. Now, you have knit dresses, right? Not just sweaters, but full dresses.
Yeah, I recently gotten into dresses because I realized that I really enjoy like TV knitting, when it's a mindless kind of stockinette all the way around. And when you are doing skirts, that's like the perfect occasion. You just have to remember when to increase or decrease. But that's all it is. You can watch your favorite TV shows in between. And as I'm really knitting 30s dresses nowadays, I gotten into watching pre-code Hollywood movies from the 30s, and it is actually pretty inspiring. And I love the skirts, like how they flow and the length and the cut, and they're just so lovely. And I really, really love to recreate that. So I actually really enjoy knitting skirts. So I only realized that like a couple of months ago when I started doing that. So I'm hooked.
I'm smiling from ear to ear because for somebody not American to know about pre-code Hollywood, a lot of Americans don't even know that. So if you're somebody watching and you don't know, there was a certain point in time where there was like a line of demarcation. Beyond that, a man and a woman could not be seen in a bed together. A man would have to have one foot on the floor. There were a lot of things like this. I'm sure about how they were dressed, what they revealed, no nudity. Before that, before they implemented this code, there were other things that were allowed. So it's really interesting. What are some of the movies that you're watching?
Can't remember the title of all of them because lately I've been watching a lot, but the last one I have seen that really stuck was Millie. It's about the life of a very young girl, a very beautiful young girl who gets married, and then she finds her husband cheating, and then you follow her life and how the men she meets are all like cheats. Um, so it is not a happy ending, but it is somewhat realistic. And actually, a lot of the prequel movies, the storyline is great. The stories they tell are great. Even the sometimes the cinema, I can't pronounce, so that how the camera moves and all that.
Cinematographer. Mhm.
Yeah, so it is really interesting, and the story I love the stories. They are very original. Or, for example, the one with Bette Davis of Human Bondage, I think it's called. That one was also very interesting, and I think that was actually an Oscar-worthy performance of hers. So
So
that was a very good movie.
sometimes these were really famous books that they were developed from, like Of Human Bondage. I forget who that is, Somerset Maugham, maybe. Um, the books won prizes. So before they even made the film, it was based on something that was really highly regarded, which is why the stories are so good. And there's many, many like that. I mean, someday maybe I'll compile a list to, tell people. But anyway, so these movies are inspiring you to knit skirts. I hope we're going to see some of them, but they all have matching tops, right?
Yeah, so I actually have a couple with me. The first dress I have made, maybe I can get it here. This one, it was a very, very interesting construction because when I bought the patterns of, oops, excuse me, off of Etsy. So the thing is that in Hungary, getting English patterns or patterns from the 1930s, it's basically impossible. So if there wouldn't have been any internet, then I could not be doing this type of knitting. So I just go there, find the patterns I like, and matching the gauge, the tension the patterns have, that's also another challenge, right? So we know that in 1930s, often they have these 30 stitches per 10 centimeter, which is to me personally is mind-blowingly small. So I have to actually check the patterns that there is something that in the tension that I can match. And this pattern that I found was actually pretty used pretty large gauge, and it was written top down. So not sure how well you can see. Oops. It was very, very similar to modern patterns that you start from the top and you have this raglan style sleeve and just go there towards the bottom. So yeah, it took some while until you get to the bottom of it. But it you was written using circular needles, so that was the other fun thing about it. To think that in the 1930s, already almost 100 years ago, it was written for circular needles, right? We are used to the fact that they have used these very long straight needles, which actually, to me personally, that they don't really work. So if I would not have the modern needles, I probably would not be knitting this much because it really um, taxes my wrists. But using circular needles at that point already, it just really allowed me to start recreating some of these dresses. And I really gotten into it. So I'm actually wearing these to work and I like showing them off and, accessorizing them using belts. Not yet into hats, so working on that. That would require probably a bit more. crocheting knowledge as well. So that's something else I have to pick up.
Knit
Oh, you
circular
need that
needle.
one. Yeah, so I haven't done a lot of hats yet, but that's on my list as well. So this was
That
one of the
was that
dresses.
was fabulous. How long would you say that took you to knit?
It takes pretty long, a couple of months, because I usually knit at night when everyone is asleep. So I work, I have three kids, so the time is pretty limited. But one of my kids keeps waking me up between 1 and 3 a.m. So that's my knitting time. And that's how I can get dresses completed.
A couple of months sounds very quick for something that big.
Yeah, but it is a stockinette, and if it's circular, then it's not taking that much time because you can really pick up speed when doing that. So it's different if you knit flat. I mean, I don't know if others have this problem, but when purling, like purling takes a lot longer for me than anything else. So,
For me, yes, it takes a little bit longer, but not any significant amount. That's not what takes me so long to knit a sweater. What takes me so long is, well, first of all, I'm not ever the size of the pattern, so I have to adapt it. And I can't just follow along row by row by row or round by round by round. I have to say,
mhm,
after I've knit 3 inches, now I have to increase where they don't have any increase. So I'm always having to pay attention, but also I think, I'm using small needles like US 1 or 2, which I think is 2.25, 2.5 millimeters. What
mhm.
size needle was that on?
This was on number 4 millimeters, so 4 millimeter needles. Yeah, so they are
I
pretty
don't
big.
usually, I don't usually see vintage patterns on such large needles. You would not
Right.
find that. Yeah, then of course it goes much faster. Oh, well, good, great.
Yeah, so these are usually the patterns I'm looking for. So I'm buying a lot more patterns than what I'm actually knitting because I really have to look for it. And finding fine yarn here, it's pretty tough. So I have seen some of your previous videos and where people and you have talked about vintage yarn. So that's the other challenge that around here, finding vintage yarn would mean finding yarn from the socialist regime time. So after the Second World War. And those were really synthetic fibers, so you wouldn't really find vintage wool yarn.
Wow, I'm really surprised. I'm really, really surprised. I would think that a big city like Budapest would have a really, maybe I need to come there and open a yarn shop with,
Yeah, there are yarn shops, but it's just modern yarn and mainly like the mainstream brands. There are some indie yarn buyers who sell off of Facebook or Instagram, but the mainstream just has the usual brands that are popular across Europe, and those are usually like thicker yarns.
like, which brands are you referring to?
Drops, for example, that's pretty
Tops.
popular around here because that's also affordable. So that's the other thing, that yarn is pretty expensive nowadays. So getting a dress worth of yarn, it can be really expensive. So for example, the one I'm knitting now, not sure if uh, this has a very beautiful color. I'm
Yeah.
not sure how well you can see it.
Yes.
It has lots of different colors in between. And this was Malabrigorios. So I thought that it was pretty um how to say, not challenging, but I was not sure whether I can really pair this with a vintage pattern. So I was a little bit of afraid of putting in so much work, and then finding out that it doesn't really work with vintage patterns. But it seems to come across okay-ish. So um, it's not yet ready. So I apologize for that. It's still missing the sleeve, but I think it's really nice. So
Lovely. So
yeah,
again, what size needle is that on?
this was 3 millimeter, but this is super wash. So this one will probably grow somewhat in the washing. So a lot of the yarn I use is superwash. So I have to actually knit it somewhat smaller um, to allow for growing in the washing.
Are there other dresses or just those?
There is there is another dress, yes, that has taken quite a bit of time. Uh, this one is actually not a full set, so the pattern wasn't written that you have the top and you have the skirt. I first have made the top because I was looking for a pattern that was written for tweed yarn. Not sure how well you can see it. It has a scarf-like thing um, that comes on top of the. I'm not sure if because it's black, it's very hard to see. Um,
Well, I
yeah,
see
and
the
then
red buttons.
yes, it has the
Oh,
beautiful check glass buttons. So I bought them. They are actually vintage from the 1930s. So I was trying to stay authentic, and I first done the jumper. And then I started looking for other patterns because I have a lot of this yarn. I have bought a whole cone. And then I decided, oh, maybe I have enough for a skirt. So I went and Googled an actual, again, a 1930s skirt pattern. And since it's black tweed, does not look very exciting on Zoom, I'm afraid. But when worn, I think it looks pretty elegant and really nice. So I get a lot of compliments when I'm wearing this. The only modification I've made was to have an elastic in the top section, so that reminds me a little bit of a modern modern twist on it, so that it doesn't fall off when I'm walking. So I'm actually using this quite a bit with a red belt a lot of times to the office, and I always feel very elegant with the long flowing skirt, and I just think it's really nice.
they're incredible. The only other person who's been on my show, well, actually, maybe two people. I think Sydney Craybaugh has done skirts for sure. I'm not sure about a whole dress, but Cole Slivka, she's done dresses. Other than you and her, I don't know too many people have attempted it because now it's not just a matter of the bust fitting and the waist fitting, but the length becomes much more important. If it doesn't hit you at the waist, it's going to throw everything else off. So I, for one, am really impressed. I imagine that other viewers are going to be super impressed too. Wow. Now,
Yeah, it is hard when you are doing like a bottom up construction, right? Because for example, with the bluish one, it was a bottom up construction, and I could only try it on after 2 months of work. So I can imagine. And I was nervous that, okay, can I get it on? Is it going to be okay? And I still haven't washed it, right? So as I mentioned, it's super wash. So after blocking it, still can change in size. So it is a bit of a gamble with all of these.
what were you knitting before you tackled dresses? Something simpler, I hope?
Yeah, I started off with dresses, so I have not been knitting for very long, to be honest. It's 3 years now. Um, yeah, it sort of started as a COVID hobby. I actually learned the knit and purl from a Danish lady while I was a student, and they were my host family. And as we know, in those northern countries, like knitting is, I think it's in their blood.
They're learning from
Yeah.
a young age in school. So, and the boys and the girls.
We don't have that here really. So that's when I first started doing scarves. And then after a very, very long time, so 10, 15 years, I have not knit anything. And during COVID, I thought, okay, maybe I need a hobby that is suitable for home. So that's when I bought yarn and it, I am still learning. So watch a lot of YouTube tutorials, bought a lot of books. I actually started buying vintage knitting books, so I have a few now. I bought some that are from the 1930s, and it's very, very interesting because usually you have books that are knitting and crocheting together. And knitting is just this tiny, tiny section, like a couple of pages where they show you the basic stitches, and the rest of the book is crocheting. So knitting in Hungary wasn't, people can do the basic knit and purl, but in our folklore, in our dresses, knitted items did not really feature. It for us, really, it was embroidery that was important. So if you think of Hungarian dresses, then they are very, very colorful with a lot of embroidered flowers, and you would not find a knitted piece. Even wool was not very prevalent, I think, in terms of garments, because you would have like leather jackets, and you would embroider those. So knitting is not a very Hungarian thing to do.
Oh, silly me. I just imagined that all through Europe, all the old grandmas would be sitting and knitting for their grandchildren, little sweaters, because it's not a hot country. It does get cold there.
Yeah, it does get cold, but still, if even if I think back, my mom did embroidery, so that's what she taught me, right? So that's what I did in the beginning. Um, of course, we have talked about knitting that, oh, it would be good to learn, and then you learn the basics, but it's not very prevalent. So it's not like you would find people in cafes or tea shops knitting. When I was in hospital and I brought my knitting along, like people were so surprised to see someone
But
knitting.
today, but I would think, I would have thought that, 80, 90, 100 years ago, that it might have been popular. I think across the world, knitting has fallen out of favor because it's so easy to walk into a store and buy a sweater for a very inexpensive price. For a long time now, you could just buy a cheap sweater. I think more and more younger people are getting into it because they want slow fashion. They want to be able to create something that is theirs, uniquely theirs. And they want to do something with their hands. Now everybody's, on their phone, so they have that dexterity, they can do it. So I think it's becoming cool again, but I think for a very long time it was uncool. Like, if you were like 30, people might say like, oh, like you're too young to be a grandma, something insulting like that. But
Hmm.
I think younger people are now starting to embrace it, at least here in America. And I think probably in other parts of the world too, is the sense that I get. And vintage is maybe helping that along because I think there's this like looking back to how did people used to dress? And isn't it interesting? And one way of achieving it, especially for people like me who aren't the size of a vintage pattern, you can get vintage things that fit you.
Yeah, I think so. I actually started collecting vintage Hungarian knitting patterns, which, as I mentioned, is very
Ah,
challenging because
so they did exist. They did knit.
so in the so they started becoming available in the 40s. So I have a couple of. So I actually have a vintage Hungarian magazine of knitted garments. This is from 1936, actually. And all of this little booklet has 2 pages on knitted garments, nothing more. And it's not an actual pattern. You just have the pictures for inspiration so that you can try at home. But how do you try if you don't have a fully written pattern? And I actually, when I was looking at it, I kind of recognize some of the ladies from the English patterns. So I actually think they just copied some of the pictures from foreign patterns and just put them on one page and said, "Oh, here's your inspiration. Try it at home," but without any additional instructions.
Well, I don't know about you, but that would indicate to me that the women were very good knitters and they would know what to do to recreate that.
Yeah, but in the 30s, like abroad, like in the UK, in the US, Canada, you have these very, very well written patterns, right? That on which lines, how much you should decrease. And even the complicated ones were written out, sometimes pages for pages, right? So that you can really recreate the exact look. And here I could not find anything from the 30s in Hungary where we would have that. So there are these magazines, and I do think they are nice. And some of the easier ones were probably um, better to try because there is just no you can't really put a handle on it if you don't know a lot of knitting. And there was no YouTube, right? So you didn't really have a chance to look up some of the more complicated stitches.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, this
Yeah.
fascinates me. I was never a history student, but when you start to get into it, you are learning a lot about history, unknowingly, unwittingly.
Yeah, and actually, so there was this one lady in the 40s, and she started writing these smallish booklets. Uh, so this is like for ladies for all occasions, and I think this is actually from 1947. So this one is a 1947 one, and I think she was the lady who really started popularizing an actual pattern that it's really written with sizes. You have the little pictures of how to size the garments. You have um, you have the stitches shown in pictures, and it actually even tells you about the tension that you should be using for your garment. And I do think that at that point it must have been revolutionary here because even in the later patterns, you don't have that. They just tell you how much yarn you need to have, and that's it basically. So if you are not, you have no idea about the tension of what does 90 stitches mean, and you try it and it either works or it doesn't. So actually I have a few of these booklets, so I started collecting them because I think they are, this one is the lace knitting one,
What's
so
the
this is
name?
really
What's the name of the woman? You said there's a woman author.
it would be Martha M. Recht. So she would, I could not really find out a lot about her, unfortunately. Um, but you can find these booklets in a lot of places because I think they were really popular. Because this was I think the first real pattern booklet that you could get, which really gave detailed instructions.
Can you hold one up so we can see
Yeah.
the whole title and her name, I assume is on the cover? Oh, her name is not there. Yes, 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 it is there where your finger is, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Good. That's
Yeah.
really fantastic thing to see, and lucky you to have found them and to be collecting them. I'm curious.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is on my list to try one of the patterns of hers. Uh, but I still have to get there. So I still need practice because she has 32 stitches per 10 centimeters. So I'm not quite there yet. I'm
Yes, you
practicing
are.
and trying to
You're there.
trying to go.
If you're able to spend 2 months knitting a dress, you could take the same 2 months and be knitting at a different tension, and you'll have a sweater that will be a little different than what you've knit before, thinner and more drape, and maybe with some interesting details that you can't get in a heavier yarn. So I, for one, would certainly encourage you to do it. What?
Yeah, it is. I definitely need to try. And
Well,
the
come
thing
on.
with these patterns,
If you can knit on 6 millimeter, you can knit on a 2 millimeter. It's the same.
yeah, probably just need the determination.
Yeah.
And you know what? The other difference I've noticed is that in English patterns, it's the 34-inch bust that was the standard. But with her, it's not. For her, it's the 38 is the
Oh,
standard.
whoa.
Yes.
These are written in
And
Hungarian?
these are written in Hungarian. And sometimes I think even 40-inch. So you would
You could
not
make a
need
lot of
to.
money if you translate these.
Right? So that was the other issue I have is that I really have to get that gauge right um i- because it's not so 38 inch for me is probably a bit even too large. So I can't do larger tension.
Perfect for me, though. Send them. I've
Yeah.
often wondered, would I be able to read a pattern in another language? Because, what are they saying in instructions? They're telling you to cast on, they're telling you to knit, they're telling you to purl. So those words you should be able to just look up in Google Translate. And then what? Increase, decrease? I mean, I would think there's like a limited number of terms that should be decipherable. So pick a
With the
pattern.
abbreviations, so I can tell you in English that was the challenge, that the abbreviations, so how do you search for what they mean? And for English, there are a lot of resources, right? So if you Google, so many things come up. Even if you type the abbreviations into YouTube, something will come up. And then you can see the video of how the stitch is done. In Hungarian, if you Google the abbreviations, nothing comes up but garbage because it just does not mean much in itself. And there are very limited resources, very limited number of people who make YouTube videos in Hungarian. So actually, that's why it was a whole lot easier to start learning knitting in English because there is just so much more material available than in my own language.
So when you read the pattern in Hungarian and you see an abbreviation, you don't know, you personally, Hungarian speaker,
I
don't
have
know
to
what,
think about it. Yeah, it's not always easy for me to figure out what they mean. And sometimes when they have these charts and the little characters in the charts are different.
okay. I'd be interested to see one of those to see if I could make heads or tails of it.
Well, I can send you one picture
Yeah,
of this.
yeah,
This is definitely out of copyright, so
pick one that you think would look good on me. And, maybe if it's my size and I could knit something without having to make the adjustments, I would put in the extra work to try and figure it out. Well, okay, let's, see where we can go
Mm.
with that. Are you going to talk about the sweater that you're wearing?
Oh, this is a modern knit actually. So this was Fabel knitwear's. Oh, I forgot the name. Uh,
Well,
oh,
she's
I can't
very
remember.
vintage. She's very vintage inspired.
Yeah, she is definitely vintage inspired. So I recognized some of the shape, some of the techniques that she has used. But I actually prefer the vintage knitting and knitting flat because you can have a really different shape of the garment. So I started with the Danish patterns, the top down, where you just separate for the sleeves and then you knit everything in one piece, but it sort of always gave the same or very similar shape to each other. So in vintage knitting, at least you can really find very different looks. So actually, let me show you my very, very first vintage knitting that I have done. Hopefully you will be able to see um, in the screen. So this was a cardigan, which I actually don't really wear because it was made from a 40s pattern and it has these puff sleeves, or I don't know how you really call them.
I think puff sleeve.
And and it looks really nice. And then you have these crochet buttons on it that you also have to make. And I just love the color. And I'm pretty proud of the edge I have made here.
It's seed stitch, knit one, purl one, and then
Yeah, yeah, seed
one.
stitch, and in the border there is just this slip stitch to make it all the
Oh,
more
on
neater.
the edge. I see. Beautiful.
When I've made this, then I realized that I don't like puff sleeve
Back
that
of
much.
the back of the neck is very interesting. The collar doesn't go all the way around. There's like a
No, no, no. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It There was no instruction of how you should finish the this collar portion, but it did not really make sense to do it any other way because they told you to use a certain length and it just wouldn't reach each other. So I decided that that's the only way to sew it up together. And I just found it very strange that the instructions of making up the garment are so vague, right? So it just make up the garment and like stitch it together. Okay, what sort of stitch should I be using?
Like for me, that is the joy of knitting from these old patterns because just like you figured it out, others have figured it out too. I've had some like very strange shoulder constructions, something with like two prongs up instead of like one prong that just folds down and becomes your shoulder pad. There were two and they came together like underneath, and then another thing came over. Once you're doing it, you just sort of tinker with it and you figure out, well, what would make sense here? And usually
Mhm.
there's only one solution to the problem. Bingo. But it makes it that little extra challenge makes it so much more interesting than just like stockinette, 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 stockinette. Like that's for the person who just wants that mindless knitting. But if you want to like exercise your brain a little bit, then you take these chances with something that's a little more unique. So good for you.
Mhm.
That's like really great that you figured it out. It could only fit here, so this must be it. And I would bet money that that's the right solution.
I'm hoping it is. Actually, it does not look bad when worn, so I do think it works. Um, but unfortunately, yeah, I just don't really like the look itself. You know, the 40s is very angled, so if you wear this with a 40s Scottish style skirt, then it just, I don't know, it's just not for me. So I decided that for myself, the 30s look a lot better. So since then, I've moved on to the 30s patterns. And I have another cardigan that I late made not very long ago. This is actually a green one. I really, really enjoyed this one. So if you see, it has all these little holes in them that are making up a line, and you have them all the way on the back too. And this was definitely not a TV knitting. So I've made so many mistakes that that's why it took so long. And then when you sew on the sleeves and placing the stripes properly as they are on the picture, oh my God, that was a challenge.
But it's worth it, don't you think?
Yeah, when you look at, so again, this is another one that I get compliments all the time on because it just ended up looking really nice. And the other thing I really like, I don't know how well you could see, is that the color of the buttons. And
Perfect.
these are vintage buttons. Yeah, they were just perfect. And it's so rare when this happens, right?
Well, having those little perforations, like you just said, it made it more interesting for you. Yes, you made mistakes, but okay, that's part of learning. So once you get it though, and you see it's so different and people compliment it, and you said it's one of your favorite sweaters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is.
So I think this is such an important lesson for people who are watching because not everybody is as accomplished as you or I. But when you make that little extra effort, the reward is great.
Yeah. So this one was actually a quick knit. I have another one here with me. Again, this is a 30s pattern. I think here the tension was about 28-ish per 10 centimeters. So I'm actually pretty proud of this one. So I've been doing that I did that for 4 months. It has, I think, thousands and thousands of bubbles. That's what it felt like. It's definitely over 1,000, not multiple thousands, but it took very, very long because it has a per three together for each of the bubbles. And it just, that was a headache when I was doing it, but it just looks so nice. And now the color is just very wide. It is supposed to come together in the back, like you have in most patterns, right?
That
Pardon?
was the front that you were showing before? I thought that was the
Yeah,
collar.
that was the front, and here I'm supposed to have buttons, but I've actually not turned them on because I decided that I really, really love the open look of this one. So when I'm wearing, it has this white color and it just looks so fantastic with a long skirt. I really love it. And it is made from a silk alpaca blend yarn and it just feels very soft to the touch. So it's lovely to wear.
That's exquisite. That's such a pretty combination of stitches. Do you know the name of this pattern?
Actually, it does not have a name, so that was also very interesting. That it's called something like a jumper made with wool string, beehive wool string, or something like that. So they didn't even name it, and there's just one lady on Etsy who was selling it. And I bought it quite a while ago, but I can look it up what the pattern was.
Okay, I mean, if you send it to me, I could put it in the show notes. I bet people would want to buy that pattern. It's so different. Wow.
Yeah, it is very nice. And then I have a couple more that are really, really 30. So I don't know about others, but I love Poirot and Miss Marple. So I bet a lot of vintage knitters like those shows as well. And when Miss Lamont is wearing the clothes and Miss Marple is wearing her iconic scarf, right? So those details and the fact that everything had buttons on it, it's just very nice. So when I came across a pattern that had the combination of both, I decided that I really have to make that. And I think what tops it off for me is that these are also actual vintage buttons. They are Hungarian buttons made of bakelite. I think you call it celluloid in English.
Bakelite and celluloid, I believe, are two different materials. One is made with like a milk product, I think.
So
Celluloid.
this is the smelly one.
Only
So
one.
I
Ooh, I don't know about smelly.
Yeah, so you can it still has a strong smell. It was one of the early plastics, right? Um, so it is definitely authentic in that sense. And when I was reading the pattern, it said use fawn and brown. So this would actually be like the original color combination. I've made this in blue as well, and this one looks. I still have not found the right buttons for this one, so yeah, it is not
It
complete yet
also
entirely.
it also has a really interesting motif. There's horizontal things going on, there's vertical things.
Yeah, I think in the 30s a lot of patterns had these horizontal stripes, so I think you would find them in a lot of different patterns.
Well, I have to look for that more because I'm short and I think those vertical stripes would help make me appear taller.
Yeah, the idea of the whole 30s silhouette was that, right? And then you would have the high heels, the long skirts. I just think they look fantastic. So I actually started buying matching skirts. But it is a challenge to get it look authentic. So
That's
still
really
working on that.
help. That's really help. I bought a lovely hat in Prague, a vintage hat. There was some little vintage
Hmm.
shop in the center of town that I fell into, and a hat that collapsed was easy to put in my suitcase. So, but finding vintage hats, and there are probably places in your city that have some of these old hats, in the back closet, packed in a box, dusty. If you look, you may find, because I think that really pulls it all together. Hats, handbags, shoes, if you can find them. There are good reproduction shoes now.
Yeah, but vintage shops around here are not very popular, to be honest. And when you visit these shops, like a lot of the things you find would be from the socialist time, and there is again a niche of people who collect that and are into that. But if you are trying to go a lot earlier, you don't really find those. So you would have to go to special sites to find this type of garments or vintage items. Um, because here people were very, very poor. So if you had something, you would have used for a very long time, right? Until it basically has fallen apart. So people, if you had like something special, you might have hold on to it. But we don't have a lot of those. So, for example, if you go on vintage shops, vintage shop websites or Instagram accounts, and you look at the US, you would have a bunch of 30s dresses, right? These beautiful crepe dresses with different cuts, and they are just absolutely gorgeous. And you find a lot of those. Here, you struggle finding one decent 30s dress.
I wonder why. I mean, I think part of what happens here, I would assume it happens all around the world. People's grandparents die. Their house is full of stuff, and they have to get rid of the stuff. They want to sell the house. So I think that's how a lot of things are found in America. Um, it has to be the case in other places that elderly people die and the younger generations want to get rid of their stuff. But maybe
Yeah, I think
it's
mostly those would be folk costumes that you would find, and those are very different looking than modern city garments. So obviously we had city garments, like Budapest was a large city, it was metropolitan and a lot of different people here. But in the countryside, it was very still heavily um, folk
well,
items.
countryside here, we have farms, we have, millions of acres of farms too. It's not all New York City and Los Angeles and Miami. No. In between the oceans, there's a lot of small towns or very rural areas too. But I mean, those people, they die also. And their stuff eventually finds its way to, I think there are like channels on YouTube or even on television where sometimes like a guy goes around from town to town looking for blue jeans, like denim that the farmers wore,
Mhm.
their children wore, and he just collects all this denim stuff. And he'll go to somebody and he'll say, like, when's the last time you were in your attic? Oh, I haven't been up there in 15 years. And he'll say, well, can we go up there and can we look? And he like opens trunks and he opens boxes and he finds unbelievable things. Maybe in Europe, people just haven't sold the houses and they're still living in them and they haven't bothered. But I think one day people are going to start discovering inside the walls and wherever, up in the attic, down in the basement. I I'm optimistic that those things
Yeah.
are
We
maybe
had a
even
lot of
more.
examples where, so for example, in my family, I know they used to have some antique items, and when times were tough, they just parted ways
Oh,
with them. So they sold them, yeah,
but they
already.
sold them to somebody who may still have,
Mhm.
and
That's true.
eventually
Yeah.
they'll die. And
Mhm. Mhm.
I think, what do they say? Everything old is new again. I think those things cycle back around, and maybe we're in a different part of the cycle than Hungary.
Yeah, so we were definitely like a couple of decades behind. So
Yeah.
I think as even from the history of knitting, from my research that I have seen here was that we were definitely a few decades behind with some of the trends that were already happening in the UK, in the US, and the other parts of the world.
Well, see, for me, being in New York, I know a little about New York history. What's interesting is the wealthy people from New York would take an ocean liner over to Europe. They would arrive in Southampton, England, or Le Havre, France. So those were like the two big places in Europe that they could sail back and forth pretty easily to. some people would do the grand tour. Central Europe was not on it. They're going to Rome,
Hmm.
going to Venice, they're going to Paris, London, maybe a couple of other places. But I think that's the reason our Hollywood movies influenced people in our big cities, and those people went to Europe and maybe brought the fashions over, but they also brought
Hmm.
fashions from France back to America. So there was
Hmm.
a lot of cross-pollination that maybe didn't trickle down to like places like Warsaw, you know, or Berlin or even Vienna. Those weren't like the key cities, I don't think, that people were traveling to then. Maybe Vienna. Yeah, I shouldn't say they were very sophisticated there too. And Berlin, I picked a bad city, but I should have picked someplace else like, Dusseldorf or I don't
Hmm.
I think, these smaller cities, it maybe took longer for it to trickle down, but the more popular cities that Americans would travel to. Yeah, well, that is all history and different time than today.
Yeah, but it is very interesting, and that's how when you are doing vintage knitting, you feel very connected to, oh, someone 100 years ago worked from this pattern, and what were they thinking? Oh, were they listening to the same radio, the same movies? So it's just very interesting. It is a lot better connection than just learning about history, because sometimes learning about history just feels so. I would say also disappointing because you would know the outcome sometimes, right? And
Or
you would
horrifying,
know that,
horrifying
yeah,
wars and people dying. Yeah, it's not joyous always. History. There's a lot of
yeah.
battles.
It- and with knitting, you just think about the everyday life that they might have lived or how it looked for them. Oh, they got up in the morning, they did all the chores, and then maybe in the evening or during winter time, they got a lot more knitting time in between. So it's just interesting to think about that.
Well, have just really one more question, unless something else comes up. You've mentioned a couple of times that you work, and I'm just going to take a wild guess. I would like to know what you do, but I'm guessing that it's something with technology because you seem very detail oriented and very methodical and organized.
I'm an accountant, so I think that fits. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's another thing that fascinates me. The more people I talk to, the more I find people are involved in mathematics, something with numbers, something with science, a lot of knitters. I don't know if we're just like the elite top tier who do the more challenging knitting, and those are the people who I interact with more. I don't know, but it seems like a big surprise to me. But I keep being surprised, and I know I really shouldn't be. Well, it must be late where you are, and I know you have kids, so I just want to say thank you for sharing this time with me and my audience. And your knitting looks really beautiful, and I hope that you will try and do more and challenge yourself to do the things that are finer gauge, and you might be surprised.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was really lovely talking to you.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you enjoyed it too. All right, thank you.
Bye.
Take care.